And we continue. Chapter 3, focus on interests, not positions. Still watching birds out here at the dam as they glide across the water. I appreciate you being with me. Consider the story of two men quarreling in a library. One wants the window open and the other wants it closed. They bicker back and forth about how much to leave it open. A crack, halfway, 3/4 of the way. No solution satisfies them both. Enter the librarian. She asks one why he wants the window open. To get some fresh air. She asks the other why he wants it closed. To avoid the draft. After thinking a minute, she opens wide a window in the next room, bringing in fresh air without a draft. For a wise solution, reconcile interests, not positions. All right, let's see. This story is typical of many negotiations. Since the parties' problem appears to be a conflict of positions, and since their goal is to agree on a position, they naturally tend to think and talk about positions, and in the process often reach an impasse. The librarian could not have invented the solution she did if she had focused only on the two men's stated positions of wanting the window open or closed. Instead, she looked at their underlying interests of fresh air and no draft. This difference between positions and interests is crucial. Interests define the problem. The basic problem in a negotiation lies not in conflicting positions, but in the conflict between each side's needs, desires, concerns, and fears. The parties may say, "I am trying to get him to stop that real estate development next door." Or, "We disagree. He wants $100,000 for the house. I won't pay a penny more than $95,000. But on a more basic level, the problem is, he needs the cash. I want peace and quiet. Or, he needs at least $100,000 to settle with his ex-wife. I told my family that I wouldn't pay more than $95,000 for a house. Such desires and concerns are interests. Interests motivate people. They are the silent movers behind the hubbub of positions. Your position is something you have decided upon. Your interests are what caused you to so decide. Gosh, I hope that's clear. Looks clear from here. Okay. They're beautiful when they move. And then they all float right back down. Alright, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, blocked out at Camp David in 1978, demonstrates the usefulness of looking behind positions. Israel had occupied the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula since the 6 Days War of 1967. When Egypt and Israel sat down together in 1978 to negotiate a peace, their positions were incompatible. Israel insisted on keeping some of the Sinai, Egypt, on the other hand, insisted that every inch of the Sinai be returned to Egyptian sovereignty. Time and again, people drew maps showing possible boundary lines that would divide the Sinai between Egypt and Israel. Compromising in this way was wholly unacceptable to Egypt. To go back to the situation as it was in 1967 was equally unacceptable to Israel. Looking to their interests instead of their positions made it possible to develop a solution. Israel's interest lay in security. They did not want Egyptian tanks poised on their border ready to roll across at any time. Egypt's interest lay in sovereignty. The Sinai had been part of Egypt since the time of the pharaohs. After centuries of domination by Greeks, Romans, Turks, French, and British, Egypt had only recently regained full sovereignty. It was not about to cede territory to another foreign conqueror. At Camp David, President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel agreed to a plan that would return the Sinai to complete Egyptian sovereignty, and by demilitarizing large areas would still assure Israeli security. The Egyptian flag would fly everywhere, but Egyptian tanks would be nowhere near Israel. Reconciling interests rather than positions works for two reasons. First, for every interest, there usually exist several possible positions that could satisfy it. All too often, people simply adopt the most obvious position, as Israel did. For example, in announcing that they intended to keep part of the Sinai. When you do look behind opposed positions for the motivating interests, you can often find an alternative position, which meets not only your interests, but theirs as well. In the Sinai, demilitarization was one such alternative. Reconciling interests rather than compromising between positions also works because behind opposed positions lie many more interests than conflicting ones. Behind opposed positions lie shared and compatible interests, as well as conflicting ones. We tend to assume that because the other side's positions are opposed to ours, their interests must also be opposed. If we have an interest in defending ourselves, then they must want to attack us. If we have an interest in minimizing the rent, then their interest must be to maximize it. In many negotiations, however, a close examination of the underlying interests will reveal the existence of many more interests that are shared or compatible than ones that are opposed. For example, look at the interests a tenant shares with a prospective landlord. Number one, both want stability. The landlord wants a stable tenant. The tenant wants a permanent address. Number two, both would like to see the apartment well maintained. The tenant is going to live there. The landlord wants to increase the value of the apartment as well as the reputation of the building. Okay, number three, both are interested in a good relationship with each other. The landlord wants a tenant who pays the rent regularly. The tenant wants a responsive landlord who will carry out the necessary repairs. They may have interests that do not conflict but simply differ. For example, the tenant may not want to deal with fresh paint, to which he is allergic. The landlord will not want to pay the costs of repainting all the other apartments. Number 2, the landlord would like the security of a down payment of the first month's rent, and he may want it by tomorrow. The tenant, knowing that this is a good apartment, may be indifferent on the question of paying tomorrow or later. Weighed against these shared and divergent interests, the opposed interests in minimizing the rent and maximizing the return. Sorry about that. Made the birds look. Okay. When weighed against these shared and divergent interests, the opposed interests in minimizing the rent and maximizing the return seem more manageable. The shared interest will likely result in a long lease, an agreement to share the cost of improving the apartment, and efforts by both parties to accommodate each other in the interest of a good relationship. The divergent interests may perhaps be reconciled by a down payment tomorrow and an agreement by the landlord to paint the apartment, provided the tenant buys the paint. The precise amount of the rent is all that remains to be settled, and the market for rental apartments may define that fairly well. Agreement is often made possible precisely because interests differ. You and a shoe seller may both like money and shoes. Relatively, his interest in the $50 exceeds his interest in the shoes. For you, the situation is reversed. You like the shoes better than the $50, hence the deal. Shared interests and differing but complementary interests can both serve as the building blocks for a wise agreement. And I continue on page 44 from the section, The Method. Focus on interests, not positions. We are getting to yes. Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In by Roger Fisher and William Ury and Bruce Patton of the Harvard Negotiation Project. How do you identify interests? The benefit of looking behind positions for interest is clear. How to go about it is less clear. A position is likely to be concrete and explicit. The interests underlying it may well be unexpressed, intangible, and perhaps inconsistent. How do you go about understanding the interest involved in a negotiation? Remembering that figuring out their interests will be at least as important as figuring out yours. Ask why. One basic technique is to put yourself in their shoes. Examine each position they take and ask yourself why. Why, for instance, does your landlord prefer to fix the rent in a 5-year lease year by year? The answer you may come up with, to be protected against increasing costs, is probably one of his interests.